Thanks for joining us this morning. We're really pleased to see the strong interest in wetland offsetting policy, and we're looking forward to an informative discussion. Next slide, please. I'm going to open the meeting with a land acknowledgement. We're gathering virtually from all across the province, and I myself am calling from my home in the west end of Toronto. This particular place is in the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples, covered with the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. It's in the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation under the Toronto Purchase, Treaty Number 13, signed in 1805. Since the very beginning, Indigenous peoples have inhabited these lands, which are still home to diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I'm grateful for the opportunity to live and work on this land, and I wish to honor and show gratitude to the original stewards as a sign of respect and willingness to learn and heal. I'm mindful of broken covenants and the need to reconcile with all our relations. Together, I hope that we will care for this land and each other, drawing on the strengths of our shared history, in peace and in friendship, being mindful of generations to come. Next slide, please. I'd also like to thank the foundations that have generously supported our wetland initiative, including the production and promotion of our wetland offsetting report. These foundations are the McLean Foundation, the K.M. Hunter Foundation, and the John and Pat McCutcheon Charitable Foundation. We're truly grateful for their support on this important issue. Next slide, please. For those of you who aren't familiar with Ontario Nature, we are a charitable conservation organization that protects wild species and wild spaces through conservation, education, and public engagement across Ontario. Established in 1931, we now represent over 30,000 individual members and supporters and over 150 member groups. They make up our Nature Network, which is a strong grassroots voice for nature conservation across the province. Chances are there's a Nature Network group in your community, and when it comes to protecting nature, they can be your ally, extremely knowledgeable and dedicated. Next slide, please. Today, you'll hear from me as I provide some background on wetland offsetting generally, and then from Sarah Hasenack, who's been leading our research on wetland offsetting since last year, and who led the drafting of the report that we'll be discussing this morning. And of course, Melina Danian will be organizing our polling in our breakout rooms and facilitating the Q&A later on. So now it's time for the polls, just so we can get a sense of how familiar everyone is with the concept and the practice of wetland offsetting. So over to you now, Melina.
Seems like I'm having a bit of trouble displaying the poll, but if we have John still on the call, maybe you can help us. Sorry, folks, 1 second.
Okay, I think the poll should be showing now. So the results are coming in. We'll just give it a little more time. Okay, last 5 seconds. Okay, so I'm just sharing the results. Can you see them, Anne, or do you want me to read them out?
Hi, John. Yes, I can see them. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Okay, well, that's interesting. So it looks like over half of the people are somewhat familiar, and about a quarter are very familiar with wetland offsetting, and then about 19% are not. And then in terms of practice, it looks like about half of the people have had no experience with policy or practice in offsetting, and then about a quarter have had some practice with policy. So we've got a mixed group for sure in terms of what people know and what their experiences are. And that's perfect because we can learn a lot from each other and we can ask questions. And it's great to know that there's some experience in the crowd, so you'll be able to share your experiences later on. Next slide, please. So, as for Ontario Nature, our expertise in wetland offsetting goes fairly deep. We've been leading dialogue and research around wetland offsetting for the past 10 years, and we've published several reports, 4 of which are mentioned here on the slide. And we're part of a panel that was established to advise the provincial government back in 2017 about how to proceed with wetland offsetting. That panel report is pretty interesting. It's a multi-stakeholder report. We've got the link on the slide, but I think Sarah's also going to put it into the chat if anybody wants to check it out that way. And then, of course, we'll circulate it later when we send out our follow-up email after the webinar. Next slide, please. So what is wetland offsetting? Well, at its very core, it's a trade-off where conservation actions are taken to compensate for the adverse effects of development. Basically, a development proponent is permitted to remove a wetland or destroy a wetland under the condition that they create, restore, or enhance wetland ecosystems, sometimes, but not always, of greater size or equal size and value. It's often premised on the goal of achieving no net loss, or ideally a net gain in wetland area and function. But in fact, it very rarely achieves such objectives. And that explains in part why offsetting is so controversial, because it's an extremely risky practice. It offers certain loss for uncertain gain. Little wonder then that there is broad agreement that offsetting should be considered only as a last resort and final step in what is known as the mitigation sequence. First, take all reasonable steps to avoid harm, then minimize and mitigate negative impacts. Only then should offsetting be considered as a strategy to compensate for any residual unavoidable damages. Next slide, please. Research has confirmed again and again that wetland offsets generally fail to replace lost wetland values. Our report highlights 3 of the major shortcomings of wetland offsetting. First is the temporal loss of wetlands. It can take 10 to 1,000 years for a wetland to fully recover from damage, even when supported by active restoration efforts. So during that interval between the negative impact and full recovery, the value of the wetland for flood control, water purification, wildlife habitat, human use, and more is diminished or lost altogether. Second, research on wetland offset performance across North America consistently reports distinct differences between the biodiversity and ecological function of wetland offsets compared to the original wetlands that they were intended to replace. That's even after many years. Third, and most immediately challenging, is locating an appropriate place to put the offset, a place where land is available, close to the original wetland, and where the hydrology, soil types, and other conditions are likely to sustain a healthy, functioning wetland. This is extremely difficult, and in heavily developed areas, it's especially difficult because there are so many other competing demands on the landscape. Next slide, please. Does this mean that we should just close the door and say no to offsetting? Well, no, it's not that straightforward. Unless we can realistically expect that there will be no more development allowed that harms wetlands, then there is a place for offsetting. If development is going to proceed regardless, then an offset is better than nothing. Next slide, please. But as a colleague of mine reminded me, offsetting to compensate for wetland destruction is like putting lipstick on a pig, and we mustn't allow ourselves to forget this. It's a Band-Aid solution and should be treated as such. Next slide, please. It's important to remember what's at stake here. Wetlands provide benefits to all of us, which include refuges and movement corridors for plants and animals, carbon storage and sequestration, flood and erosion control, water purification, wild foods and medicines, and opportunities for recreation and tourism. These benefits are critical at any time, but especially now, faced as we are with the dual crises of biodiversity loss and climate change. Next slide, please. These benefits have significant economic value, and that can certainly sway some decision makers, we should hope. One economic study commissioned by the provincial government conservatively estimated that the benefits of wetlands are worth at least $51 billion per year in Southern Ontario alone. Another study released out of the University of Waterloo in 2021 estimated that the water purification benefits alone were worth more than $4.2 billion per year in Southern Ontario. And another government study found that wetlands have a significant role to play in reducing flood damages and costs, up to 29% in rural areas and up to 38% in urban areas. The bottom line is, at the end of the day, natural wetlands are best. We should do our utmost to retain them on the landscape. Offsets rarely compensate for the damage done, especially when one considers the full suite of benefits that are at stake. Next slide, please. Despite the risks, offsetting for damage to wetlands and other natural features is becoming increasingly common. In 2021, the Greenbelt Foundation did a survey of municipal and CA participants, and 24 out of the 26 participants of respondents to the survey indicated that they had participated in some form of offsetting. Similarly, we did a scan earlier this year, just took a look at the municipal plans in the Greater Golden Horseshoe and found that 75% had policies requiring some form of compensation for damages to natural heritage caused by development, not just wetlands, but natural heritage generally. Next slide, please. Late last year, the Government of Ontario posted a proposal on the Environmental Registry about developing a natural heritage offsetting policy. The initial discussion paper included some very promising elements, such as a net gain goal and an avoidance first approach, so the mitigation sequence. However, given other law and policy changes that have gone forward since that time, including the gutting of the Ontario Wetland Evaluation System, I think we have reason to be concerned about what lies ahead. Will this policy simply grease the wheels of development? All of us, including local planning authorities, need to be prepared to respond if and when the provincial policy does come forward. Next slide, please. And that, of course, is what our new report is all about, being prepared. It was written by Sarah Hasenack, me, and a municipal planning and policy expert, Michael Winia. The PDF is now available on our website, and we'll also circulate a link to the report in the email follow-up to this information session. And so now I'm going to pass the virtual microphone over to Sarah. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Anne. And Melina, you're already ahead of me, which is great. On the next slide. So we wanted to start by giving a little preview of what you could expect from opening this report. And it basically encompasses three main sections. So we start with an introduction to what offsetting is, its growing popularity, and the risks involved. So Anne briefly introduced many of these points in her slides, but the report itself goes into a little bit more detail and provides the citations for a lot of the research. Then we provide a framework of 10 criteria for effective offsetting policy based on significant points of agreement among industry experts. These criteria are intended to provide a framework by which to draft and evaluate offsetting policy to create the best possible outcomes for nature given the risks involved. Then the bulk of the report is used to highlight real examples of strong offsetting policies from municipalities and conservation authorities in Ontario for each of the 10 criteria, including an analysis of what makes each example strong. For each of the criteria, we've also provided a draft policy wording that we feel begins to meet the criteria about as well as we can do at this point. Next slide, please. Thank you. So to prepare for the report, we first did a review of wetland offsetting research, essentially updating our knowledge since our last report, which was published in 2017. We then reviewed municipal official plans and conservation authority policies to get a better sense of what's happening with offsetting policies across Ontario, especially the Greater Golden Horseshoe, and to identify strong examples that could serve as models for others. Once the report was drafted, it was reviewed by municipal planning and policy expert Michael Winia, as well as 2 Indigenous colleagues, Larry McDermott and Chris Craig, and their comments and insights improved the report immensely. In fact, as Anne kind of alluded to, Michael Winia had made such significant contributions and additions to the report, especially in those draft policy wordings, that we invited him to join us as co-author. Next slide. So now that we've introduced a bit about what the report kind of covers, we thought it would be nice to cover some of the key elements in a little bit more detail to give a flavor for what's in there. So I'll start by going over those 10 criteria that underpin the framework. So on the slide here, you can see the first 5, the first one being that commitment to achieving a net gain. So offsetting needs to be about more than just mitigating harm or even achieving a no net loss situation. Maintaining the status quo is simply not sufficient. We need to work to reverse the historical and ongoing loss of wetlands in Ontario, apologies. The next one is consideration of diverse wetland values. So achieving that net gain should be premised not only in terms of wetland area and extent, but also in terms of other ecological, cultural, social, and economic values that should be accounted for. Third, offsetting should, of course, be premised on respectful engagement with Indigenous communities based on free, prior, and informed consent. And as mentioned earlier, offsetting must always be treated as a last resort after avoiding, minimizing, and mitigating harmful impacts. Again, this is known as the mitigation sequence, and it's embraced by experts pretty well across the board. The trouble is that it's rarely fully successfully implemented, so there needs to really be some strong policy wording around requiring adherence to this sequence. And last for this slide, we have limits to, sorry, could you just go back, Melina? Thank you. We have limits to which ecosystems can be considered for offsetting. So this criterion acknowledges that offsetting is simply unsuitable for certain types of wetlands or circumstances. The term used often in the literature is irreplaceable. So bogs and fens, for example, are irreplaceable because we can't replace them in any meaningful time scale. They take hundreds to thousands of years to develop. Provincially significant wetlands are also irreplaceable because they're known and identified as having features and qualities that are simply too valuable to lose. Okay, now you can move to the next slide. Thank you. Number 6 is strategic offset site selection. So as Anne also mentioned, finding an appropriate site to locate an offset close to the lost or impacted ecosystem is one of the key challenges with this practice, especially in areas that are already heavily developed. So if we're going to go down this road, we need to make sure there's a process in place to identify a suitable site to locate the offset. Number 7, reduction of time lags and provision of long-term protection for offsets. The policies should consider and minimize those temporal losses, meaning the time between when the natural wetland is lost or damaged and when the offsetting project is sufficiently well established that it's able to provide similar or the same values. And it's also important to ensure that that wetland offset is protected for the long term. So at least as long as those negative impacts to the natural ecosystem last, but ideally the protection should be permanent. Number 8, monitoring of offset performance. The policy should require that monitoring occurs regularly and for enough time to ensure that permit conditions and policy objectives are being achieved. And where that monitoring reveals that maybe they aren't being achieved as well as they should be, steps must be taken to address those shortcomings. At number 9, offsetting policies should set out specific metrics and methods for measuring gains and losses of identified values, and thus ensure that enough gains are being realized to make up for the accepted losses. These metrics need to be carefully selected to ensure that they are relevant measures of the values of interest, and they should be kept as consistent as possible. And finally, transparency in reporting. Policies should ensure that there's regular reporting on offset outcomes and that the findings are available to the public, as this is an important component of trust and accountability. Next slide. Okay, so I know I whizzed through those a little bit quickly and simply in the interest of time didn't go into too much detail. But for more detailed explanations of those 10 criteria and the rationale behind them, you can see our online primer, which is available on our website, or pages 7 and 8 of the new report. But for now, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the key strengths and policy gaps that we found as we were looking through policy examples for each criterion. Next slide, please. Thank you. So starting on the positive side, we found that examples of strong policies already exist among Ontario's local planning authorities for many of the criteria. Most notably, we found strong examples where Ontario municipalities and conservation authorities are committing to the principle of net gain, adhering to the mitigation sequence, establishing limits to what can be offset, and setting up strategic site selection processes. Next slide. So on this side, I wanted to showcase what one of those policy examples looks like. I've chosen to feature this policy from the County of Peterborough's official plan, where they've made a really strong commitment to the mitigation sequence, as well as setting limits to what can be offset. I know it's a lot of words on one slide, which we tried to avoid, but I did highlight quite literally the keywords that stood out to us. And as we explain in our analysis of this example in the report, the policy clearly outlines and requires strict adherence to the mitigation sequence and defines each stage. Avoidance is clearly prioritized, as an amendment to the official plan would be required to move beyond that avoidance step of the sequence. This significantly increases the requirements associated with pursuing offsetting, called compensating in this particular example, but it means the same thing. And it appropriately discourages development premised on offsetting without adequate consideration of earlier stages in the sequence. Also, as I mentioned, the first paragraph in the policy clearly establishes that wetland offsetting, or again, compensation, will only be considered for non-significant wetlands, which satisfies one of the other 10 criteria, setting limits to what can be offset. And again, this is only one example of some of the strong policies that we feature in our report with our analysis, just to show kind of how we presented the information if you were to dig into the report itself. Next slide. Thank you. Now, on the flip side of what we found while scanning policy examples, we did find some notable gaps where there are very few, if any, examples of really strong policies in Ontario at this point. For example, we identified policy gaps in the inclusion of social and cultural values in policy goals, requirements and guidelines for meaningful and respectful engagement with Indigenous communities, the consideration of Indigenous cultural values specifically when setting limits to offsetting, relevant indicators and methods by which to quantify gains and losses, and requirements for public transparency and reporting. Now, that's not to say that there aren't good intentions among those practicing wetland offsetting at this point, and perhaps some of these things are even happening in practice. We can't know because we're not there working on the ground in each of the communities. However, these are some areas where the policy wording is really lacking, and that leaves the door open to lower the bar, which is especially dangerous with such a risky practice. Next slide. So for those criteria where we didn't find strong existing policies, we hope that the draft policy wording we provided with plenty of support from Michael Winia will be especially useful in helping to at least partially address those gaps. So here's an example of the draft policy wording we provided for scope of offsetting policy goals. So while there were some policies that require offsets to replace both area and ecological function, we couldn't find an example that considered the social and cultural values of wetlands. And excluding the social and cultural values has a particularly significant implication for impacted Indigenous communities. You can see here in the draft policy that we've tried to help local planning authorities better account for the full range of values impacted by wetland losses and more effectively compensate for those lost values through offsetting where it's appropriate. Next slide. So there's no doubt that offsetting has a long way to go if it's going to fully or even close to fully compensate for the damage done when we lose a wetland. Nevertheless, in a couple of our earlier reports, we did highlight several examples of offsetting where the outcomes, if not quite perfect, were certainly positive. And these examples included projects where most, if not all of the criteria we've recommended are followed. For those kind of good news stories and examples, I'd recommend our 2016 report on biodiversity offsetting in Ontario, or our 2017 report on Indigenous perspectives on conservation offsetting, both of which are available on our website at ontarionature.org/resources-publications. And I'll also share the links to those reports in the follow-up email for this webinar. Next slide. So what I'd like to highlight as we're just wrapping up our presentation is that we're faced with both risk and opportunity when it comes to wetland offsetting. The risk is great, as we've emphasized throughout the presentation, and prioritizing the protection of natural wetlands will always provide more robust ecosystem functions, services, and values. But where wetland loss is unavoidable, there's opportunity here as well. If we can't achieve perfection in offsetting, we can certainly continue to learn and do better than we've done in the past. And to that point, municipal and conservation authority planners and leaders have a really important role to play in developing effective policies that will protect local wetlands and reverse the ongoing trend of wetland loss and decline. There are many who are already out there setting a solid example and leading the way. Others interested in this practice will be able to pick up on their trail and join them, learning from and building upon their experiences. Our hope is that this report on wise practices will help to enhance understanding of the need and options for appropriate offsetting policies. Because in a world where so many natural areas have already been lost or severely degraded, we simply cannot afford to proceed with anything but the utmost caution. Next slide. Thank you. So we've gotten kind of to the end of our formal presentation portion of the morning into afternoon session. And we've set aside the next 15 or so minutes to do some breakout room discussions. We're going to use the questions on the screen to guide those smaller conversations. And we really hope to just provide this opportunity for everyone here to discuss your experiences and perspectives with your peers who are working in similar positions across the province.
All right, thanks everyone. We hope you had enough time to have an in-depth conversation. It looks like everyone's back to the main room. We will now move over to the Q&A section. If you have any questions for the presenters, it'd be great if you could add them on the chat, and I'll do my best to moderate them. Or if you don't have, okay, there we go. We have a question already. You can also share something that you found interesting from the conversation you just had. So Janelle is asking us, is there an offsetting ratio for wetland area compensation, which is greater than 3:1, which Ontario Nature recommends to ensure successful net gains?
I can try to answer that. I mean, my recommendation is the higher the ratio, the better. And that's for a number of reasons. Partly the uncertainty of it all. And you know, that long-term piece. But yeah, the 3:1 ratio, also you think about what you're including in that ratio, right? It's not simply a question of the number of hectares. And I mean, it could be 3:1's pretty clear cut if you're talking about hectares, but as soon as you talk about factoring other things in, and in our group, we talked about, you know, removing and managing invasive species and that sort of thing. As soon as you factor into those quality questions, then the ratio becomes, you want it to be high, you want it to be more than 1:1, but it's exactly what it should be, I think, would depend on the specific context. Sarah, do you have anything to add there?
I'm trying to think of an example that goes above 3:1, and there may be, I'm just not remembering fully all the details, but what I can speak to is that there are a few conservation authorities that have almost a sliding scale for offsetting ratios, where if there's a high amount of trees that are large and have a lot of like a wide diameter, then they will increase the ratio for offsetting to try to recognize for the fact that planting one small tree does not replace one big tree. So instead they'll do 10 small trees to replace one big tree, which again, we need to recognize and be aware of the fact, of course, that 10 small trees are not one big tree, but it's that attempt to kind of overcompensate with the younger trees in order to provide at least the kind of the same carbon biomass as the large tree, and that those will mature into the large trees over time. So that's one way of approaching it as well, and trying to get those larger ratios for particularly valuable or older ecosystems.
Hey, thank you so much. Next question. Does the report include or intend to introduce any success story of offsetted wetlands?
I can jump on that since I'm already unmuted. So the report itself doesn't have any examples on the ground. It's a policy exercise and review. So we're looking at policies that we think are most likely to be successful on the ground. But we do have our earlier reports that have some examples of both successes and maybe less successful examples of offsetting, with a bit of discussion around why those things may have gone well or not so well. And we'll be distributing those reports in the follow-up email. There are 2016 report on biodiversity offsetting across Ontario, as well as the Indigenous perspectives on conservation offsetting, which was 2017. So we have some examples there of success and not so much.
And I'll just add to that, Sarah, you know, pessimistic as I am, cautious as I am, I want to hear the good news stories. I want to know about those successful examples. And I think we all need that. We all need to know that there is potentially a light at the end of a rather dark tunnel, and we can strive to understand how the success occurred, what were the factors leading to success, and then try to promote those factors and emulate them in our practice. Thanks for the question.
Wonderful. We don't have any more questions. We invite attendees to, we have a couple of minutes left. If you have any final questions, comments, anything you'd like to share, to add it on the chat. Okay, Michelle is saying, I think everyone is excited to dig into the report. Sounds great. Thanks so much.
That's very exciting to hear. Thank you. And if I can maybe just add on to that, if there's nothing in the chat immediately right now, that's a sense I got out of my breakout room discussion as well, that folks are really interested in looking at this, which is nice for us to hear because we put a lot of work and wanted it to be helpful. So it's nice to hear that you all are seeing this as a useful resource that you want to look at.
Yeah, and we have another comment from Adriana saying, really pleased with the work Ontario Nature has put into this very timely topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adriana.
Wonderful.
Thanks. And I just need to say that our work reflects the work that's being done by others, right? Trying to bring forward these wise practices. That's because people like you on the ground are working on it and, you know, learning and if we can share those lessons learned, then it makes us very happy. And I think what I learned one of the things I learned in my breakout session was that there are a lot of people working on developing offsetting policies in response to the government's announcement about the big provincial policy. So that's interesting. That's good. I mean, that shows that people are trying to get up to speed and ready for what's coming down that pipe. And as we mentioned in the one slide, there's a lot of offsetting occurring across the province. So let's make sure that we understand the risks and that we do our best to address those in our policies and practices.
Absolutely. And we have a comment from David saying, I think it's important to recognize that formal offsetting lies within a framework of ongoing, non-compensated, unapproved wetland laws in Southern Ontario. So thank you so much, everyone. We have come to the end of our webinars. Thank you, Anne and Sarah, for this great presentation. Thank you to all attendees for joining. We will follow up via email with a recording of the webinar. Please remember to complete the post-webinar survey. It'll pop up on your screen right after the session ends. And if you have any questions, follow up with us via email. And thanks so much. We hope you have a wonderful day.